his voice became shaky. He was emotional, and he put up his middle fingers and said, "Fuck the tough guy show." In this room of like 30 tough-looking ski lift leaders, and it just crystallized so much of my thinking and some of the conversations we've had, Jim, around how this pressure to be a certain kind of man has limited us, and it hurts us, coming down to the ultimate kind of hurt of killing oneself. Hi, this is Ed Frauenheim, and you're listening to Expansive Intimacy with Jim Young.
Welcome to Expansive Intimacy. I'm your host, Jim Young, and I'm on a quest to help men like you and me discover how to apply intimacy to unlock new, expansive versions of success in your relationships, your work, and your life. With each episode, we'll take another deep dive into the intimacy toolkit to show you how you can enhance your emotional intelligence, leadership abilities, and relationship skills. So settle in and open up, because it's time to get intimate. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Expansive Intimacy. I'm your host, Jim Young. Have you ever had an experience where somebody says to you, "Hey, you should meet such and such. They're just like you." And then you go and you meet the person and you're like, whoa, what did they think I was like? What did they see? Well, a couple years ago, a friend of mine, Liz Solomon, who was on a previous episode, said something like that to me. She's like, "Hey, I've got this friend you should meet. He's the Jim Young of the West Coast." And I was like, okay. And then she introduced me to Ed Frauenheim, and I knew what she was talking about, and I was actually happy about that. I met this guy who I connected with immediately, who shared a ton of the same values, had interests that matched mine, was funny just like me, haha. And we just started a long conversation and friendship, and we've done a bunch of things since then. Ed's my guest today, and you're going to hear us talk about a bunch of topics that fall into that circle of things that Liz connected us with over a couple of years ago. We talk about what it's like to be men in the world today, what it's like in organizations when we're in the business world working as leaders, the pressures that build up, and some of the ways that we can start to adjust to the way that society has changed kind of underneath our feet, and in ways that most of us never got any real kind of training or education about. We talk about teal organizational theory. We talk about how to reinvent masculinity, what confined masculinity looks like, and the effects that it has on us mentally, physically, socially. We also break down this arrow and circle concept that we have toyed around with for well over a year now. You hear that towards the end of the episode about how we can take this drive that we have as men and connect it to more expansive ways of being connected to the world. Ed also courageously shares some of his most vulnerable stories, and I'll let you listen to those for yourself. In terms of where Ed comes from, he's a writer. He's an author of a book called Reinventing Masculinity, Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection. He co-founded a group called the Teal Team that studies and advocates for more soulful organizations. And he's done a lot of other writing in publications like USA Today, Harvard Business Review, Fortune. Really talented guy. He's an author, a speaker, a coach, a consultant, and formerly was a director of research and content at Great Place to Work Institute. Some deep experience with looking at and understanding workplace dynamics with this really cool filter of what it's like to be a man in that setting. So without further ado, let's get my West Coast doppelganger, Ed Frauenheim, onto the show. Ed Frauenheim, as I first knew you, the West Coast version of Jim Young via our mutual friend, Liz Solomon. So good to see you.
Great to see you too, Jim.
Thanks for coming on to the show. I've been waiting to have you on here so we could talk about some of the things that we always talk about, which end up coming back to expansive intimacy in many forms. And let's just start with the question I always start with. How do you define intimacy?
I define intimacy as closeness, closeness with people. And I would say what I've come to see in around intimacy in men, especially over the last several years, is that it is a rich territory that we consider taboo. And I would love to see and help men realize that um, letting their guard down, taking the mask off, with not just their primary partner, say a wife or a spouse, but with friends, with other family members, sometimes with colleagues. That there's such um, a soulfulness that's possible and a richness to life that we can enjoy if we are willing to be courageous enough to get close to people.
Mm. There are so many different jumping off points there from our dozens, at least, of conversations that we've been a part of over the last few years. I want to start with one about an experience that I know you had where you had somebody in a workshop you were running just kind of break through some of that ice you were just talking about by saying something like, it's time to fuck the tough guy show. Like, let's
Hmm.
stop pretending that this stuff isn't for us. Could you just share a little bit of that story?
Sure. And Jim, yeah, this is one of my peak moments of the last, you know, several years as well. And I all credit to Jay Ridd, who used those terms. The background there is that I was co leading a workshop on leadership with our mutual friend Paul Tallner, and this was for folks in the ski industry. And Jay, who is the an executive at Diamond Peak Resort in Nevada, spoke up around the topic of psychological safety and the need to make space for people to talk about how they're doing. And he said
Mhm.
that two men had committed suicide at his resort, two employees over the last 18 months. And he blamed it partly on the fact that these guys never spoke up and that they were feeling the pressure as so many of us do as guys not to reveal what they're really going through and to pretend, as you put it, that everything's fine. And so, he got his voice became shaky, he was emotional, and he put up his middle fingers and said, "Fuck the tough guy show." In this room of like 30 tough looking ski lift leaders. Um, and it just crystallized so much of my thinking and some of the conversations we've had, Jim, around how this pressure to be a certain kind of man has limited us and it
Mhm.
had hurts us, um, coming down to the ultimate kind of hurt of killing oneself.
Yeah.
Um, so that was a wonderful moment. As painful as it is, Jay's phrase has led him and me we to lead a couple of workshops in the last couple of years where we named it that. We called it "Fuck the Tough Guy Show." And we've led workshops with increasing numbers of men and women coming to talk about how we can get past a hyper masculine, harmful work culture in the ski resort industry. And that's been a really gratifying work over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it just resonated with me when you first told me that story, especially to hear a leader and especially knowing the type of guys that were in that room. Somebody who's running a ski lift or maintaining those. We're not talking about, when we say the ski industry, people who are designing ski apparel. We're talking about
No.
people who are out there in the harshest conditions doing really tough work, true tough guys. And from the standpoint that we usually think of tough guys, and this leader saying, you know what, we're literally killing ourselves, not figuratively, like literally people are killing themselves
Hmm.
because of these societal norms that are fucked up. And
Yeah,
so let's stop.
I love that your book subtitle is "How Tough Guys Defeat Burnout," and this is really a case where Jay's vulnerability around his anger and his care, his love for these two guys has helped to crack that industry open.
Mm,
So for this past summer, we had about 70 plus people in a room in the same conference, the Elmo conference, lift maintenance and operations education conference. And more guys and women, but especially the guys, are talking about that culture of where we have to man up. We have to pretend everything is fine. We get to pretend, we have to pretend that we have no emotions when
Hmm.
we're suffering. And it was a year of burnout in the ski industry, in the California area, because there was so much snow, people could not get days off. They never saw the sun. In fact,
Hmm.
for weeks at a time, there was so much storm. There were so many storms, and it was just an overwhelming um, experience for these folks. And they were, thanks to Jay and this workshop we offered. Again, it was called F the Tough Guy Show Revisited: How to Create a Healthier Workplace Culture. Uh, they let off steam and they talked about how we need to make space for that full range of human emotions, especially for us guys, and for us to not have this expectation that we're going to just bottle everything up.
Hmm. That leads me into something else I wanted to talk about. It's one of the first things that I knew about you when I first got introduced to you was that you had written a book that gets at what's going on for men, and also what's a new model and how can we get there. You wrote a book called Reinventing Masculinity, in which you talk about these two archetypes, the confined masculinity and liberating masculinity. And I hear that shift going on perhaps at that Elmo conference with Jay's work, with the work
Hmm.
that you're leading. Could you just unpack that a little bit of, what is that thesis of the book, and what do those two archetypes look like? How do we move between them?
Thanks,
Just in like
Jim.
five
Yeah,
seconds, like if you could just cover all of that, that'd be
yeah.
awesome. Cool.
No problem. I'm a tough guy. I could get it all done. Uh, no, thanks for that invitation. My co-author and I, Ed Adams, identified this traditional masculinity, and we called it confined masculinity. And we were writing, we published it in 2020 at a time there was a lot of conversation around toxic masculinity and the Me Too movement. And we were really conscious to kind of honor how men have been showing up in the world, and not, kind of um, tar everyone with this brush of that men are poisonous somehow or toxic. And it's more that we have had very limited sets of options for ourselves in terms of how we relate to others, and the kind of roles we can play. So we identified, those main circumscribed roles, like the provider, the protector, the procreator,
Mhm.
and then the ways we relate are almost entirely about competition, and about um, domination, stoicism, and self-reliance. And what we kind of identified is that is not really setting us up for success. And maybe it never has fully, but especially in the world that's emerging, this 21st century, where things are faster, they're flatter, they're more fairness focused, and that old way of working doesn't set us up for success in life, and nor does it set us up for success in a work world. And that was kind of my expertise, bringing a lot of exposure to and research into the best companies in the world, while Ed Adams brought this more psychological perspective. So that was the confined masculinity piece, and the problems we noticed in it. Men have got to show up differently if they're going to thrive today.
And your work with Great Place to Work has informed a lot of that, right? Looking at corporate cultures from a scientific, analytical, and also experiential standpoint. Where do you see confined masculinity? Like, what does it look like in the workplace?
It looks like barking bosses. It
Uh-huh.
looks like hyper competitive cultures. You could really say that the workplace, by and large, is a hyper masculine setting. It's which is to say, it's largely been around those features I mentioned before. It's almost always about fighting to rise to the top, dominating your competition, but also your internal colleagues, because you want to get to the top of the being the king of the hill. Be that
Hmm.
alpha dog. And there isn't a lot of room for emotions, or the spirit, intuition. Um, and we see ourselves as largely self-made men. You know,
Yeah.
we're self-sufficient to the point of isolating ourselves. And the problem with that approach is that it leaves men rigid, cold, and isolated in a world that's now calling for flexibility, warmth, and connection.
Hmm.
And that's where the liberating masculinity can come in, and offer guys a new way to show up at work and beyond.
Yeah, 'cause I want to see how that connects to that innate drive. Because I think we have this drive to say, I want to succeed, I want to achieve. Whether we like it or not, we compare ourselves to other people. We're always measuring up against the Joneses, against what society says is success. And it's easy to say, oh, we'll just drop that. But then it's like, oh, you look at your neighbor's house, or you look at the car you're driving, you look at your job title. There's this striving that I don't think we can get rid of. I think it's part of the system we're in, and until that system changes, I don't see it going away. That pressure. So
Mm.
how can we, as you know, I'm an improviser, and I live by the yes and principle. So how can we say yes?
Mm-hmm.
The system is going to give us that pressure, and we're likely to give into it, and we want to do it differently. How can we do that in
Mm-hmm.
using liberating masculinity or other means?
Yeah, that's a great point you have, around the striving and the keeping up with the Joneses. It's really deeply ingrained in us, Jim, as especially as guys, I think. Um, and I think, to yes and it, like, we can play the game and change the game.
Mhm.
I think in particular, what we talk about with liberating masculinity is, can we come to a deeper sense of our self-worth that isn't dependent on, besting others, that it actually sees, connection and compassion as central to our identities. And when you start believing in those concepts, those principles, you then aren't seeing yourself as, a competitor racing to the top. You're seeing yourself as part of a team that's maybe trying to achieve a deeper purpose. And that's what I see in a lot of these guys that are really embracing this fuller sense of being a human being, and being a fuller man. Is, I'm not around about my own individual success anymore. I'm about a legacy of making the world a better place, of
Mhm.
improving my community, of, really setting the kind of role model for my kids or and those around me, that is, eulogy virtues as opposed to resume virtues. That's a
Yeah,
phrase
I
Thomas
love that.
Friedman uses. And so that starts happening when we talk about the liberating power of compassion and connection. And I have really seen that in guys that are, saying, yes, maybe I've been compassionate in the way I've tried to serve my family, but I'm now going to, like, really embrace it and be expressive, learn how to be emotionally intelligent, to be vulnerable, to be intimate, and see that my relationships can deepen and improve. And when I see myself truly connected to others and to the world, I have a different approach, where you're not about yourself. You don't see yourself as an island. You see yourself as part of an archipelago, or
Mm,
an ecosystem. And your success really depends on everybody else's success too. So you can rise up in organizations, and in fact, increasingly the way to rise is to support others in rising.
yeah, I the way I hear that in like the simplest terms is I win converts to we win, and I'm
Hmm.
part of we, so therefore I win. And
That's
so
a nice way to put it. Yep, going from that I to the we is brilliant.
yeah, um, which brings me into another topic I always want to talk to you about, which is different ways of going through the world, organizing ourselves, operating in a business setting. So a lot of what we're talking about here ends up coming back to our careers and our work, the businesses that we might own, run, or be a part of. And you and I have talked about the principles of teal quite a bit, and you've been working at this for quite a while. Have a lot of different uh,
Hmm.
irons in the fire in that. For listeners who may not know what teal is, could you just give a quick synopsis of what we're talking about when we say teal? And then I'd love to dig in a little
Yeah,
bit more about like how can we use this concept to tie things together?
yeah, I love that, Jim. Teal is a organizational philosophy, that basically is calling for more soulful organizations. And by by that I mean, um, it is a philosophy that comes out of a theory of human development and stages of human development, where we are now moving to a place where we are, uh, trusting ourselves to manage our teams on our own. So there's sort of a more democratic, self-managed approach to work as opposed to a top-down hierarchy where people are being bossed around a lot.
Mhm.
It also, that's one of three pillars. The other one, or the second one, is about holism, where you can bring all of yourself to work, and we see our connections to nature and to other people. So we're much more integrated as individuals and as organizations. So we can bring our kind of intuition. We can bring our spiritual callings. We can bring our different identities. Say if we're not traditional white male leader, where we're making space for people of different backgrounds. It kind of incorporates the DEI push, I believe. Um, and then the third principle is about evolving purpose. And that's sort of noticing how not only ourselves as individuals, but our organization is called to show up in the work it's called to do. So it not only is it purpose driven rather than profit driven, but it is a constantly changing, attuned to what is needed by our organization, by this collection of people. So it can come across as a little of a new age woo woo approach to thinking about organizations. But the interesting thing is the organizations that have experimented in this territory are thriving.
Yeah.
That when people are given the power to make decisions and choose how they run work their job and run their organizations as opposed to being told what to do, largely all this energy is unleashed. And when they can bring their whole selves to work again, it's suddenly the human dynamo is present, not just that sort of like clock in clock out person. And that purpose piece again, like we're the research has been clear for a long time that purpose is a stronger driver of people than pure money incentives. So we're really in some ways unleashing, I hate that term has been overused, but it really is unleashing so much more human creativity when we create these teal organizations. And it really dovetails with the kind of masculinity we've been talking about too. Like the man of teal is really a liberating man
Mm.
in the way we've been talking about it up to now.
And that mode also, to me, allows men to take a ton of the pressure off of themselves.
Mm,
That I've
mm-hmm.
got to be the guy. I've got to lead the charge. I've got to carry all the water. Right? Like this is what's going on that leads to people getting to that point of despair, of the
Yeah,
pressure is too much. And you referenced it before in the story about the ski lift operators. The rate of suicide, deaths of despair, addiction, divorce, all of these really negative life consequences for men are higher. And
yeah,
especially as men get into their midlife years. And we could look at, well, what's going on with health statistics or addiction or divorce, and we could say, well, there's other things going on. There's the aging process. I really think a lot of it is this internalized pressure that we put on ourselves to succeed and be a man, be man enough. And in a teal organization where it's about some kind of higher purpose that's inspiring, okay, I'm excited about my work, and I don't have to be in charge of everything, and I get to
yeah.
be real. Like when I'm having a day where I'm just really feeling under it, I don't have to show up and puff up my chest. I get to be like, yeah, you know what? I can't carry the water today. Can you guys help me out?
That's so well put, Jim. And as you're talking about that more conventional approach of men feeling all that pressure, I was thinking about some of my oldest friends from middle school and high school, grammar school even. And as we've stayed in touch, and I've watched some of them play the game, try to rise up the corporate tower in different fields, finance or law, and I just seen them so um, beaten down
Mm.
and hurt in different spheres of life, whether it's mental health or it's a relationship, marriages that don't work out. Um, and you and I have talked about this too. Your own journey as finding that you're lying on the carpet with
Yeah.
nothing to give. And not to put you on a spot, but you talk about this publicly, right? Like the burnout
Yeah.
you felt and that I felt too, trying to make it up that corporate ladder. And you're right, the teal approach I has been so freeing to me such that I'm just enjoying most of what I do with the colleagues that I work with in this teal team that I co-founded, and also the teal men of teal group that you and I created. It is it's such a breath of fresh air, and it's like that weight has been lifted, and we can be real, as you put it.
One of the
Teal
spaces that I
allows real. Teal allows real. I
Teal
think we just
allows
came.
real. Absolutely. I knew we'd get to some kind of bad rhyme slash dad joke on this episode. I appreciate you, Ed.
Yeah,
Um, the Men of Teal group that you just referenced is one of my favorite places. And you and I started
same.
that, I think it's over 2 years ago now, close to it,
Hmm.
if it's not over 2 years.
Yeah.
And we've been meeting every month. It's been a core group with some people coming, some people going, but about 8 of us every month for 90 minutes. We're now going to 2 hours. I think I missed the last meeting. You all wanted
Hmm.
to go to 2 hours
Yeah. Not enough time.
because there's not
Right.
enough time. We want more time, and these conversations are just they're unlike anything I've ever experienced. And like, tell me, what do you get from Men of Teal? Like, I have a sense. I know what my experience is, but
Hmm.
what do you get from this place where we get to just show up and talk about anything and everything every month?
Well, I would say it's you could use the term expansive intimacy for what happens there.
Yeah.
We are talking about our lives. We're talking about our shared interest in the teal philosophy, but mostly as it applies individually. We aren't really out trying to change the world so much as support each other.
Mm,
But I feel like what we learn, and when each of us has a chance to tell our stories and the challenges we're wrestling with, we often end up focusing on one person, one of the, say, eight or nine guys that are in it, what their particular issue is. Maybe it's a relationship issue, maybe it's a work issue, or we've talked about more generally, what we see in society. But especially when we've talked about, a dilemma in a man's relationship,
mhm.
or in my case, I've talked a lot about professional anxiety, financial anxiety, or wrestling
Yeah.
with anxiety,
And
and
the physical impact it's had on you.
yeah, panic attacks that I've had, and how I've been knocked down physically, and had to do a lot of resting and taking time off of work. The comfort I've received from the group of guys there, and the sense of not being alone, of it
Mm.
being
It's exactly what I
this
was gonna say. Like,
the
I don't
care,
feel
and yeah, go
alone
ahead.
when I go there because
Mm,
we can talk about everything,
yeah.
and there's nothing that's not on the table. And that's the thing that's unique to me, is like to be in a group of a bunch of guys, different ages, different walks of life. I mean, a lot of us are
Hmm.
have a lot of commonalities, but that I can just share anything. Like, I can be
Yeah.
open with a bunch of guys about whatever's going on in my life, whether it's my romantic life or whether it's something about my parenting or whether it's my business. And to have that place, I, it's just, it's mind boggling how good it feels every month to, even if I don't share much of anything and I don't get any direct support, to be a part of that circle just makes me feel like, oh, okay, cool. I belong with some people here.
I love that. Yeah, same for me. And I would add that even when it's not me sharing my story or my challenge, the wisdom that comes out as other men do that, and I see how brave they are in talking about what they're going through, and some of the tools we've used, where we're it's
Mm,
not a traditional, I don't think it's a traditional kind of support circle like you might have, a father support circle, say, or
yep.
AA circle, because some of the things we've done that are really in that teal mindset, where we're bringing poetry, we're bringing artistry. Our colleague Morley
Quiet
especially does these
contemplation.
drawings.
Hmm.
Yes. Just the range. We have a wider range. We have an expansive way of connecting,
We get to
and
bring our
that
whole
has been so
selves.
rich.
Hmm.
What was the thing you just said?
We get to bring our whole selves.
Yeah,
You know.
more than I would have even knew.
Yeah.
I don't think of myself as particularly poetic, but Morley has invited us to be bringing that to the table.
Yeah, I love that because I have this thing about drawing, and I've always thought, oh, I don't want anybody to ever see anything that I draw, and so I just
You
wouldn't
have awesome
draw.
drawings. Yeah.
And our friend Morley, who's a part of this group, really brings all the tools out of the toolkit. Doesn't care what anybody thinks about it, and he creates these beautiful drawings. And for me, it was like, oh wow, I could access something else about me that I couldn't verbalize by writing it, by drawing it out instead of trying
Yeah.
to use my logical brain, but I could use some other kind of creative part of myself. Um,
And
I
can I
want
just
to,
go
yeah,
ahead?
go
Go ahead.
ahead. You
Well, I
got a
just
thought?
think that uh, not that all guys are going to be jumping into this teal territory. Like it may be a little too spiritual or far a bridge, far away from what their comfort zone is. But I do think there's something about just the concept that men have been in that box. We've been in that confined territory, and there's so much more when we start stepping outside of it.
Hmm.
Even taking some baby steps of, let me connect a little more with some of my old friends, or let me, be a bit more honest with my own kids, and try to be a little bit more vulnerable with them about how I'm doing. Just there is so much more available to us, and I think that comes back to that concept of that soulness. That's what that real feeling of comfort and
Mm.
challenge at the same time is, to me, around our Men of Teal group and some of these ways of operating where you just feel like I'm not clicking on all cylinders as a human. I don't like these mechanical metaphors, but it's like you're just fully alive. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of guys feel largely dead.
And isolated. I was reading an article this morning,
Hmm.
yet another article talking about isolation and loneliness for men. And
Yeah, yeah.
we can sit there and say, "Oh, well, that's not manly, right? That's I don't talk about that stuff with people." And we can sit in the loneliness of that. Like we have the feeling, and if we're not out there telling our kids how frustrated we are that we're not connecting with them and that we haven't had a chance to talk with them in a while, or we're not sharing with our partner what's going on, or we're not talking to our colleagues, like we sit with that loneliness, and that's what's building up inside of us. That's what's
Hmm.
getting these people, these men especially, to this place where it's just too much. And so what choice are
Yeah,
we making? Like what's the tough guy move? And your workshop title speaks volumes to it, of like, hopefully we don't have to get to that place. And
yeah.
I want to ask you one more, get into one more topic with you, because you've had and been very open about mental health challenges and anxiety and panic attacks, which
Hmm.
is something that a lot of guys would just shut down. Like, I'm not gonna say anything to anybody about that. I'm not gonna post on LinkedIn about it, God forbid. How did you get there? Like, what made that a
Mm.
logical move for you?
I don't think I had a choice on some level, Jim.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Well, I guess
it-
to clarify that, then, like, what helped you decide to open up about that at that point on
mhm.
the rising temperature thermometer of that buildup, as opposed to the guy who just
Mm.
holds it and holds it and holds it in, and then has an even worse outcome?
I will give a lot of credit to our mutual friend Liz Solomon on this stuff, because um, the trigger for me talking more about anxiety was having a heart attack about 2.5 years ago, a mild one, thankfully, probably stress related. And in the wake of the heart attack, I came home and I immediately started having anxiety attacks that I was having another heart attack. And
Hmm.
and that kind of steamrolled, and I've had bouts of anxiety throughout my life, and this was a pretty severe one, and I had got to a pretty dark place during it. But at this point, I was surrounded by people that were tealy, you could say,
Hmm.
and Liz was my coach at the time. So and it was an interesting thing because I could tell my closest friends and my wife, who is Rowena, who you know and has been amazing, and she was right there with me during all these health challenges, mental health and physical health. But what I started doing after that heart attack 2.5 years ago was expanding the circle of people I talked about anxiety with, my clients, my coach. um, more kind of distant friends. And what I noticed when I talked to them, almost to a person, they were kind, and they said, "I have had similar things," or "I know someone who has deeply wrestled with this stuff too." So again, it was all of a sudden I didn't feel alone, and I was it was the weight was lifted, and I felt free.
Yeah.
And amidst all this challenge and some very dark moments of like just doubting I could even ever work effectively. That's how the panic attacks would sometimes make me just exhausted and needing to like take naps, long naps during the day. I still take shorter naps, but during that bout of that, part of what allowed me to get back on my feet, heal, was that wider circle that I had shared some of my deeper vulnerabilities with.
I just think it's incredibly brave, and I applaud you for being as vocal as you are about it. Because I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but so many of us deal with mental health
It's like
challenges.
1 in 4,
Yeah, and
roughly.
and
That's what I've
and I
seen.
imagine that, if we look at the full spectrum, it might be higher than that. I mean, between anxiety, depression, burnout,
Hmm.
there's just so many ways that we can be affected by stress, especially in the modern world that has gotten so fast. And if we try to go it alone, it's just too much. And yet we still have that story going on for men in our culture that we just got to buck up. We got to suffer in silence. And for you to speak out about it, I just appreciate the example.
Thanks, Jim. I think another thing that helped me at that time and to be vocal and more candid, um, besides knowing I was surrounded by people that would make space for me and care for me, is, a silver lining of the pandemic. It became more okay to not be okay.
Hmm.
And amidst all the pain and death and suffering of COVID, at least we got some greater space to talk about mental challenges. And I see that in my main client, an organization I work with, that I has really taken mental health challenges seriously. The chief people officer talked about her own experiences with panic attacks and anxiety. That led dozens of people in the company to come talk to her. It led a male
Yeah.
executive talk about mental health challenges in a public newsletter item. Um, so I think we're making progress. So I have not been the most courageous in doing this, but I'm glad to be part of
Well,
the
we don't
work
need to
to
compete
make it
on
more
that, right?
expansive. I'm number one.
We can link arms and
There
share
you
that.
go.
I've had my own bouts with mental health issues. Newton Chang, who is one of the first guests on the show, talks openly about his
Hmm.
own mental health challenges. I've had other guests who've touched on that,
Yeah.
and I appreciate you. It reminds me of a social media post that I saved a copy of a couple years ago that says, I think somebody posted, "How do men get through shit without crying?" And somebody responded, they had the answer: bottle everything up until we die of stress induced heart failure in our 40s, like real men.
Well,
Right? This is what
that
we're
sums
fighting
it up.
against,
Yeah.
and
That's
it's
the tough guy
cheeky,
show
and
right
it's,
there, right? And bottled
I
up.
read it, I laughed out loud, but then I was like, oh my God, there's so much truth in that.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate any time there's a man who's willing to stand up and say, whoa, 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 we can do this differently. Let me talk about my own struggles. Let me talk about what I'm learning. Let me reach a hand out. That's a lot of, I think, what we're trying to get done. I know you and I think we have a very similar purpose in trying to open up some doors for men to be able to find other ways to get through a really challenging life, and especially a challenging time where expectations are changing. And how do we navigate this? Um, and I know you're doing fantastic work on so many realms, because we've talked about collaborations, and we've read each other's material. We've helped edit stuff for one another. Um, I'd love to have you share with listeners any last parting thoughts, anything we didn't get to, but also, where can people find you? What are you up to that you'd love people to know about?
Thanks, Jim. Um, I guess on the parting thought front, I would say remember that we have a whole humanity to ourselves as guys, and that for so long we have walled off part of it. And you and I have talked about something we didn't talk about today, Jim, but this idea of an arrow and circle masculinity,
Oh, you know
where
what?
we
Let's talk about that for a second, and
okay,
we'll find time for that. Go ahead.
all right, and you and I came up with this idea. It's one of my favorite ideas still, like that masculine symbol of the Mars symbol, or the you see it on bathrooms sometimes still, like the circle with the arrow going up to the right. We've been so arrow only as
Mm,
men for centuries, where we're just about aggressiveness, aloneness, penetration, um, and we lost this circle side. That's more the, if you want to go yin yang in the Eastern terms, like we've been all yang, and we have forgotten that yin of like receptiveness, being,
mhm,
compassion, connection. And so I just personally have felt such benefits in my own life, such richness from embracing that circle as well. And the guys that I see around me doing it are similarly having a richer life. And it's not just richer in the sense of your relationships and your soulfulness, which is probably the most important one, but it'll help your pocketbook, because
yeah.
increasingly at work, you've got to show up as emotionally intelligent, as someone who knows how to keep a team from burning out, as someone who knows how to um, acknowledge, that we're part of a broader circle where we've had a lot of the privilege. We've got
Mhm.
to be allies and aware of the white male, if we're white men, the advantages we've had, even if we've worked hard. Others have had to work harder. So it's all acknowledging all that stuff allows us, and living into these new skills, the softer skills of connection, collaboration. These are what are allowing us to thrive at work today. So you'll get richer in your bank account and your, if you will, your soul account, by embracing this wider sense of being a man.
And the thing I love about the conversations we've had on that is that it's not a choice, right? We're not choosing the softer, more feminine style of being receptive, being good listeners, being emotionally intelligent, being connected, being group oriented, all of those things.
Hmm.
Or
Right.
we're going to be this tip of the spear, hard driving, high achieving person. We get to be both. In fact,
Hmm.
when we bring the circle into connection with the arrow, we have both of those energies. Well, maybe I'm really, I really lean into my listening and my intuition and my networking, and I grow my network of opportunities, and then I use my drive. I use
Yeah.
that sharp, directed energy that I have, the masculine quality that we love and we need. We just need them
Hmm.
both.
Exactly. That's so well put. And hey, kudos to you for embodying that, Jim. Like even with this podcast and all the work you're doing, I see you really embodying arrow and circle masculinity.
Oh, thanks. I mean, part of this podcast, as we were talking about before we started recording, is to expand the circle, to get more people into this conversation. And I had to your point, like I had to integrate those things. Okay, if I want to expand the circle,
Hmm.
I've got to take action. I've got to make it
Hmm.
happen. And and so if that's
Yeah,
a simple example for people to follow, to say, okay, how can I get more out of life and create that kind of balance and integration? Cool. Go find your way because we need it.
totally.
Yeah. So Ed, how else are you helping folks in the world? How can people find you? Because Ed's got some amazing skills and talents as a writer, as a coach, as a facilitator, and I would love people to know where they can look you up in case they want to, engage with you about ideas, services, whatever.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I all those things you mentioned, I'm glad to be doing. And I would add speaking and giving workshops too. On like this, I'm excited about giving a tough guy show workshop at a ski resort coming up next month. And it's not, and I'm going to be looking to talk about similar issues in the legal profession coming up next year. So happy to be kind of bringing some of these questions and observations about masculinity and where we're headed to different industries and fields. And you can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at my website at edfrauenheim.com. And you can find me monthly at the Men of Teal meeting with Jim.
Yeah.
At this point,
Well,
it's you got to kind of get a permission to come in and
by
join this. But
invitation only right now,
yeah,
but hopefully
but
we could spin
excited
that
to
out
connect
to
with
more.
people.
Yeah, so Ed, we will put all of those links and some more info about the work that you're doing out in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this conversation. I can't wait for our next one.
Thanks so much, Jim.
All right, thank you for joining in for another episode of this long-running conversation where we're exploring how intimacy can affect our lives in all sorts of positive ways, whether in our personal relationships, at work, with our friendships, and our parenting, and beyond. And with all that in mind, I have 2 questions for you before we wrap up. First, what's one thing you heard on today's episode that could help you start to expand the intimacy in your life? Either some kind of discovery you might do internally or some step you might take towards another person. Second, who's somebody that you thought of during today's episode, somebody who popped into your mind that maybe could benefit from hearing this conversation as well? Would you consider sharing the episode with them right now? It'd be a fantastic way to continue expanding intimacy to even more people. Lastly, I have a bunch of other resources available for folks who want to continue exploring intimacy, starting with my book, Expansive Intimacy, How Tough Guys Defeat Burnout. I have a bunch of other resources that I'd be happy to share with folks. Just reach out to me, jim@thecenteredcoach.com, and I'd be happy to help you on that path as well. I hope you'll be back next week for another episode of Expansive Intimacy.